Hi, my name's Kevin and welcome to part 6 of the build of my little Gerry's steam engine. In this video we're going to have a look at just building one of the small linkages which is going to link the slide valve to the eccentric for our timing of the air going into the engine, or because I'm going to be running this on compressed air and not steam. So anyway, so here we are, we're just setting up and we're going to be using a slit and saw just to cut the linkage. So this is a 1mm slit and saw, so quite a thin saw. And here can you see the comparison between a 2mm and a 1mm. So anyway, we'll go off to the mill and we'll have a look at this small piece we've got in the vise. The piece of brass what's in the vise is very small. It's only 5mm square by about 6mm long. So I'm having to hold it in the vise right on the edge. So this is probably going to be quite a tricky machine. I'm hoping that the piece of brass isn't going to fly out of the mill vise. But anyway, we'll see how we get on. Well, here we are, we're just lowering down the slit and saw just to an approximate centre. I mean, I'm just eyeballing this, and then we'll start the cuts. Because that piece of brass, as you can see, is only held in by a small amount in the vise, I'm just going to have to take it easy and do probably several cuts. I think it ended up being about a dozen cuts or so. Otherwise, if I took a too deep a cut, that piece would just fly straight out of the vise. The linkage is 1.5mm thick, so after I've cut this first cut, which is a 1mm wide one, I just have to open the cut up a bit. So I'll move it up a 1/4mm or so, and then move it back down from centre, a 1/4mm, and that'll give me a 1.5mm, just enough for that linkage to slot into. The bolt which is going to hold this linkage in is a M2.5 cap screw. Or socket head screw. So I've got to make sure that the slit or the cut is deep enough to accommodate that, because the end of this piece of brass is going to be rounded over as well, so we don't want the bolt to, the socket head to be sticking out above the rounding over. So I'm just making sure that I've got the slot cut deep enough. So that operation is now done, and we'll take out the slit and saw, and then we'll put in a centre drill, and we'll use that just to mark the hole where it needs to be. And then again, all I'm going to do is just eyeball where the hole's got to go. It hasn't got to be a whole 100% exact thing. As long as it eyeballs to the centre, that'll be fine. Right, so we'll now just move the table around and just get that more or less in where we need to drill that hole. And here's a close-up, and as you can see, we're more or less where we need to be. Although it looked about right, I thought, well, I'll just double check. So I just grabbed one of the bolts and just made sure that hole is going to be far enough back. And I just needed to wind back a bit more, and then that was ideal. Yep, I'm happy with that. So we'll just mark that hole. and then we'll just take the centre drill a bit deeper, and that will give us like a pilot hole for the drill bit to go into. The reason we use a centre drill is because it's a really rigid drill, and it won't wander, not like a drill bit. I mean, a drill bit would be sticking out of the chuck probably a couple of inches or so. So as soon as you start to try and drill a hole, the end of the drill bit would just wander, you know, and you'll have an inaccurate hole. So that's the reason for using the centre drill, just to give us a pilot. And then we'll now put the normal drill in, 2.5mm in this case, and then we can drill that hole all the way through that piece of brass. So that's that piece done now. As you can see, it was only gripping that right on the very end, and here you can actually see how small that part is in my hands. So quite a fiddly part. So the next stage is to silver solder the actual linkage rod. That linkage rod will be the piece which actually goes into the slide valve to connect onto the slide valve itself. So here I'm just laying it out on a brick. The brick is going to help maintain, you know, the heat from the heat gun. And I've got a couple of pieces of steel just to hold it all nice and square while I silver solder it. These parts are only very small, so for the silver solder to actually silver solder this joint, we won't need a lot of heat into this at all. So we've just got to be very careful that we don't get it too hot. And as you can see, what I'll do is I'll test it. I'll put a bit of heat into it first, and then I'll test it here. You'll see in a minute. Here, we still haven't got quite enough heat in here, so we'll just put a bit more heat in. And as you can see, the silver solder then flows straight away once we've got that heat into there. And that's all it needs, is just a dab of silver solder. It's only a small joint, and then that's all now complete. And obviously it's hot. Right, so I've got a little jig here. This is what I use to round my, rather than trying to do it by hand, because using a file, I'm not, you know, to try and get a nice curve around the end of this piece. This is the best way, which I've found for, you know, the way I like to do it. So what we do, we just set a jig up in the sander, and then I'll show you how that works. Well, here's our linkage with the square end. So what we're going to do now is, we've got a piece of aluminium in here with a bolt sticking up through, as you can see. We're going to slip that linkage over the top of this, and then we're going to use the sander to actually sand around on the end of that piece of brass. And here we are, we're now going to start the sanding, and you'll see there's the curve starting to appear. So we've done that little first bit of the stage, then we'll push in the jig a bit further until we get to where we want to, we want it half round all around the end of that piece of brass. Here I'm just testing to make sure it's not going to be cutting too deep. And again, we just rotate that round that bolt, and as you can see, it's now starting to sand a bit further in. Obviously you've got to be careful with your fingers, because this part is so small, it's easy to take the skin off the end of your fingers. So here you can see we're probably a little way to go, so we'll just keep sanding that until we get a nice rounded end. So that looks about right now, and as you can see, we're more or less there. So one more cut should do it. Move the jig in a bit further. And there you go. And let's put a perfect round on the end of that piece of brass. Well, all what's left to do now is just to give this a quick sand on some wet and dry. This will just remove the flux residue and the discoloration from the heating process. And then once that's done, we can just install that back into the engine, and then I'll show you the slide valve in action. And here's our piece of brass, all back to nice and shiny. So we'll now put that in the engine, and here you can see it actually in situ. So you can see at the top there our piece of brass which we've now polished up, and now you can see the whole of the slide valve in action. So anyway, I'd like to thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel, and then we'll have another video in the not too distant future. Thanks for watching.